On Wednesday, October 18th, 2017, 2317 West Muhammad Ali Boulevard, that used to be called Walnut Street, was demolished by the city of Louisville. The roof had started to cave in. Falling bricks and debris were threatening to damage the house east of it, so an emergency demolition was ordered. My grandfather, Willis Cole, purchased the house in 1922. My grandmother lived in it until the early 80s, and I got the idea to preserve it sometime in the mid-80s. I wanted it to be a small neighborhood museum that housed my grandfather's memorabilia, or be the first Black historical home in Louisville, since I didn't know of any others. I never knew my grandfather. He died before I was born, but I always heard stories about him. When I was growing up, people would say, "Oh, you're Willis Cole's granddaughter." Everybody in the Black community knew who he was and spoke of him with great reverence and respect. My grandfather had a newspaper called the Louisville Leader from 1917 to 1950 when he died. It was a weekly race paper. That's what they called Black newspapers back then. My grandfather started his paper with $50. Ultimately, he owned a 2-story building at 10th and Walnut, which used to be part of the Black Business District. It was called the Willis Cole Publishing Company. Black newspapers at that time were nationwide networks of information. Since we were invisible in the white press, race papers were major organs that existed in Black communities across the country. Black journalists in those days were all civil rights activists, and they used the written word to protest and advocate against issues oppressing Black people. My grandfather has been described as a strong-willed, religious, outspoken, and militant man. He was known for his astute editorials, and many of them were published in other newspapers. One slogan for the Leader was, "It is your newspaper. It is militant, but stable." But his activism went beyond the printed page. He was slated to run for state senator on the newly formed all-Black Lincoln Independent Party ticket in 1921, and there is the Bard Fleming case he fought with his mentor and colleague William Worley to keep 2 Black men from being hanged in Madisonville, Kentucky, for allegedly raping a white woman. I was even more fascinated about my grandfather after the University of Louisville archives put a substantial collection of the Leader that my dad had saved on microfilm in 1977. It was amazing to scroll through the microfilm and read and see the articles and ads and editorials by my grandfather, especially one about Marcus Garvey. When my grandfather purchased 2317, he had a new wife, my grandmother, Rosa Long. He had 4 children under the age of 7 from his deceased first wife, Catherine Walker, and would have 2 more children, my dad in 1923 and my Aunt Tella Marie in 1927. They all grew up in 2317. My Aunt Catherine was married there. My grandparents had their 25th wedding anniversary there. My great-aunt Mamie died there. And my family lived on the 2nd floor until I was about 5. And my grandfather died in his bedroom there, and his body laid in state in an open casket in the living room. When my grandmother was moved out of the house, my Aunt Catherine rented it out. That was the beginning of the decline and deterioration of the house, and I think of the Russell area. When all those original homeowners died out and desegregation allowed us to live wherever we chose, the next generations moved away and never came back. It's happened to Black neighborhoods all over the country. I remember beautiful homes and yards in the Russell area. It would break my heart when I would come to Louisville and drive by the house and see people hanging out on the front porch and the front door sitting wide open where you could see into the house. And then crack came to town, and it blighted the whole neighborhood. When the last renters were removed from the house, it was boarded up. We had to get a dumpster to clean it out. The kitchen was infested. literally covered black with roaches. For more than a few years after that, people would routinely break into the house and vandalize it. The cellar door and broken windows had to be replaced countless times. Homeless people would camp out in it, and when I thought there was nothing left to steal, a whole side of wrought iron fencing was stolen. But this was happening to houses throughout the Russell area. I live in Harlem in New York City. I'm a performing artist. There is nothing steady in my life but change. So, even though my advocacy for the house was steady over the years, it was intermittent, despite my visiting about 3 times a year. My dad and my Aunt Catherine signed their shares in the house over to me, but the other shares were spread out between a list of cousins and children of a cousin who had passed away who I'd never met. And even with oral commitments from 4 of my dad's siblings, when they passed, it left a legal nightmare that I could never untangle. And so my grandfather's name is still on the original deed, and I could never clear the title. In 1996, I applied to have a historical highway marker installed in front of the house. The house was still intact then. The marker was dedicated in 1997. There was a ceremony and reception. It was a big deal. I had found a lady, Penelope Fisher, who had worked for my grandfather and had a column called Penelope's Pen. It was awesome having her there. Everyone was so proud, and it gave me hope. It was a tangible start to make my vision for the house a reality. It was a small victory, but I was really hopeful and encouraged by it. The upstairs, I figured, could be office quarters. But it was the first floor living room, the dining room, my grandmother's bedroom, and my grandfather's bedroom, which was off the dining room, that I could vividly remember and imagine how to reconstruct and preserve. I still have some of my grandmother's personal items, pieces of her silver, my grandfather's set of Harvard classics, pieces of furniture, the original iron grating from the living room fireplace, and a baby grand piano that used to sit near one of the front windows is still in the family. I remember my grandmother playing hymns on it, but it belonged to my Aunt Ella Marie, who was a child prodigy on the piano. At 16, she was refused entrance into U of L because it was still segregated at the time, so she went to Oberlin. And the archive of letters and photographs and papers that my grandmother saved is just an incredible treasure trove. But the house has been demolished. A few years before, I made a connection with the city, and there was interest to preserve it. I thought, finally, I'll have some solid support and some real progress can be made. I kept paying off back taxes and keeping the grounds maintained, but I couldn't afford to fix the roof. And the opening in it got bigger and bigger, and the inside of the house was exposed to the elements for too many years. Too much rain, too much snow, wind, and scorching sun. I knew the house could not make it through another winter without a roof, and it was frustrating to know that a preservation grant that would replace the roof was being withheld because of some internal city bureaucracy. And so the roof caved in. I cannot dismiss the role my family played in the demise of the house, but this did not have to happen. But it did. And now, the only saving grace is that the historical highway marker is there, and it cannot be removed.